Ox, Side 1. He had at first only a few pupils, but soon the news went about that behind the lips of an ox and the mouth like a sea, there was a kindly heart and a well-furnished mind, and in the end he could boast that 3,000 young men had studied under him and had passed from his home to important positions in the world. Some of the students, once as many as 70, lived with him like Hindu novices with their guru, and they developed an affection that often spoke out in their remonstrances against his exposure of his person to danger or of his good name to calumny. Though always strict with them, he loved some of them more than his own son, and wept without measure when Hui died. There was Yen Hui, he replied to Duke Gai, who had asked which of his pupils learned best. He loved to learn. I have not yet heard of anyone who loves to learn as he did. Hui gave me no assistance. There was nothing that I said which did not give him delight. He did not transfer his anger. He did not repeat a fault. Unfortunately, his appointed time was short, and he died, and now there is not such another. Lazy students avoided him or received short shrift from him, for he was not above instructing a sluggard with a blow of his staff and sending him off with merciless verity. Hard is the case of him who will stuff himself with food the whole day without applying his mind to anything. In youth not humble as befits a junior, in manhood doing nothing worthy of being handed down, and living on to an old age, this is to be a pest. He must have made a queer picture as he stood in his rooms, or with nearly equal readiness in the road, and taught his disciples history and poetry, manners and philosophy. The portraits that Chinese painters begot of him show him in his later years, with an almost hairless head gnarled and knotted with experience, and a face whose terrifying seriousness gave no inkling of the occasional humor and tenderness, and the keen aesthetic sensitivity that made him human despite his otherwise unbearable perfection. One of his music teachers described him as he was in early middle age. I have observed about Chung-Ni many marks of a sage. He has river eyes and a dragon forehead, the very characteristics of Huang Ti. His arms are long, his back is like a tortoise, and he is 9 Chinese feet 6 inches in height. When he speaks, he praises the ancient kings. He moves along the path of humility and courtesy. He has heard of every subject, and retains with a strong memory. His knowledge of things seems inexhaustible. Have we not in him the rising of a sage? Legend assigns to his figure 49 remarkable peculiarities. Once, when accident had separated him from his disciples during his wanderings, they located him at once by the report of a traveler that he had seen a monstrous-looking man with the disconsolate appearance of a stray dog. When they repeated this description to Confucius, he was much amused. "Capital," he said, "capital." He was an old-fashioned teacher who believed that the maintenance of distance was indispensable to pedagogy. He was nothing if not formal, and the rules of etiquette and courtesy were his meat and drink. He tried to check and balance the natural Epicureanism of the instincts with the Puritanism and Stoicism of his doctrine. At times he appears to have indulged himself in self-appreciation. In a hamlet of 10 families, he said with some moderation, there may be found one honorable and sincere as I am, but not so fond of learning. In letters, I am perhaps equal to other men, but the character of the higher man, carrying out in his conduct what he professes, is what I have not yet attained to. If there were any of the princes who would employ me in the course of 12 months, I should have done something considerable. In 3 years the government would be perfected. All in all, however, he bore his greatness with modesty. There were 4 things, his disciples assure us, from which the master was entirely free. He had no foregone conclusions, no arbitrary predeterminations, no obstinacy, and no egoism. He called himself a transmitter and not a maker, and pretended that he was merely passing down what he had learned from the good emperors Yao and Shun. He strongly desired fame and place, but he would make no dishonorable compromises to secure or retain them. Again and again he refused appointments to high office from men whose government seemed to him unjust. A man should say, he counseled his scholars, I am not concerned that I have no place. I am concerned how I may fit myself for one. I am not concerned that I am not known. I seek to be worthy to be known. Among his pupils were the sons of Mang He, one of the ministers of the Duke of Lu. Through them Confucius was introduced to the Zhou court at Luoyang, but he kept a modest distance from the officials, preferring, as we have seen, to visit the dying sage Lao Tse. Returning to Lu, Confucius found his native province so disordered with civil strife that he removed to the neighboring state of Qi, accompanied by several of his pupils. Passing through rugged and deserted mountains on their way, they were surprised to find an old woman weeping beside a grave. Confucius sent Tse Lu to inquire the cause of her grief. "My husband's father," she answered, "was killed here by a tiger, and my husband also, and now my son has met the same fate." When Confucius asked why she persisted in living in so dangerous a place, she replied, "There is no oppressive government here." "My children," said Confucius to his students, "remember this: oppressive government is fiercer than a tiger." The Duke of Qi gave him audience and was pleased with his answer to a question about good government. "There is good government when the prince is prince and the minister is minister, when the father is father and the son is son." The Duke offered him for his support the revenues of the town of Linqiu, but Confucius refused the gift, saying that he had done nothing to deserve such remuneration. The Duke was minded to insist on retaining him as an adviser, when his chief minister dissuaded him. "These scholars," said Gan Ying, "are impractical and cannot be imitated. They are haughty and conceited of their own views, so that they will not be content in inferior positions. This Mr. Kung has 1,000 peculiarities. It would take generations to exhaust all that he knows about the ceremonies of going up and going down." Nothing came of it, and Confucius returned to Lu to teach his pupils for 15 years more before being called into public office. His opportunity came when, at the turn of the century, he was made chief magistrate of the town of Zhongtu. According to Chinese tradition, a veritable epidemic of honesty swept through the city. Articles of value dropped in the street were left untouched or returned to the owner. Promoted by Duke Ting of Lu to be acting superintendent of public works, Confucius directed a survey of the lands of the state and introduced many improvements in agriculture. Advanced again to be minister of crime, his appointment, we are told, sufficed of itself to put an end to crime. Dishonesty and dissoluteness, say the Chinese records, were ashamed and hid their heads. Loyalty and good faith became the characteristics of the men, and chastity and docility those of the women. Strangers came in crowds from other states. Confucius became the idol of the people. This is too good to be true, and in any case proved too good to endure. Criminals put their hidden heads together, no doubt, and laid snares for the master's feet. Neighboring states, say the historian, grew jealous of Lu and fearful of its rising power. A wily minister of Qi suggested a stratagem to alienate the Duke of Lu from Confucius. The Duke of Qi sent to Ting a bevy of lovely sing-song girls, and 120 still more beautiful horses. The Duke of Lu was captivated, ignored the disapproval of Confucius, who had taught him that the first principle of good government is good example, and scandalously neglected his ministers and the affairs of the state. "Master," said Tse Lu, "it is time for you to be going." Reluctantly, Confucius resigned, left Lu, and began 13 years of homeless wandering. He remarked later that he had never seen one who loves virtue as he loves beauty, and indeed, from some points of view, it is one of the most culpable oversights of nature that virtue and beauty so often come in separate packages. The master and a few faithful disciples, no longer welcome in his native state, passed now from province to province, receiving courtesies in some, undergoing dangers and privations in others. Twice they were attacked by ruffians, and once they were reduced almost to starvation, so that even Tse Lu began to murmur that such a lot was hardly appropriate to the higher man. The Duke of Wei offered Confucius the leadership of his government, but Confucius, disapproving of the Duke's principles, refused. Once, as the little band was traveling through Tsi, it came upon 2 old men who, in disgust with the corruption of the age, had retired like Lao Tse from public affairs and taken to a life of agricultural seclusion. One of them recognized Confucius and reproached Tse Lu for following him. "Disorder, like a swelling flood," said the recluse, "spreads over the whole empire. And who is he that will change it for you? Rather than follow one who withdraws from this state and that state, had you not better follow those who withdraw from the world altogether?" Confucius gave much thought to this rebuke, but persisted in hoping that some state would again give him an opportunity to lead the way to reform and peace. At last, in the 69th year of Confucius, Duke Gai succeeded to the throne of Lu, and sent 3 officers to the philosopher, bearing appropriate presents and an invitation to return to his native state. During the 5 years of life that remained to him, Confucius lived in simplicity and honor, often consulted by the leaders of Lu, but wisely retiring to a literary seclusion, and devoting himself to the congenial work of editing the classics and writing the history of his people. When the Duke of Shi asked Tse Lu about his master, and Tse Lu did not answer him, Confucius, hearing of it, said, "Why did you not say to him, 'He is simply a man who in his eager pursuit of knowledge forgets his food, who in the joy of its attainment forgets his sorrows, and who does not perceive that old age is coming on?'" He consoled his solitude with poetry and philosophy, and rejoiced that his instincts now accorded with his reason. "At 15, he said, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30 I stood firm. At 40 I was free from doubt. At 50 I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60 my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70 I could follow what my heart desired without transgressing what was right." He died at the age of 72. Early one morning he was heard singing a mournful song. "The great mountain must crumble, the strong beam must break, and the wise man wither away like a plant." When his pupil, Tse Kung, came to him, he said, "No intelligent monarch arises. There is no one in the empire that will make me his master. My time is come to die." He took to his couch, and after 7 days he expired. His students buried him with pomp and ceremony befitting their affection for him, and building huts by his grave, they lived there for 3 years, mourning for him as for a father. When all the others had gone, Tse Kung, who had loved him even beyond the rest, remained 3 years more, mourning alone by the master's tomb. 2. The 9 Classics. He left behind him 5 volumes, apparently written or edited by his own hand, and therefore known to China as the 5 Qing, or canonical books. First, he edited the Li Qi, or Record of Rites, believing that these ancient rules of propriety were subtle aids to the formation and mellowing of character, and the maintenance of social order and peace. Second, he wrote appendices and commentaries for the I Ching, or Book of Changes, seeing in this the profoundest contribution yet made by China to that obscure realm of metaphysics which he himself had sedulously avoided in his philosophy. Third, he selected and arranged the Shi Ching, or Book of Odes, in order to illustrate the nature of human life and the principles of morality. Fourth, he wrote the Chun Chu, or Spring and Autumn Annals, to record with unadorned brevity the main events in the history of his own state of Lu. Fifth, and above all, he sought to inspire his pupils by gathering into a Shu Ching, or Book of History, the most important and elevating events or legends of the early reigns, when China had been in some measure a unified empire, and its leaders, as Confucius thought, had been heroic and unselfish civilizers of the race. He did not think of his function in these works as that of an historian. Rather, he was a teacher, a moulder of youth, and he deliberately selected from the past such items as would rather inspire than disillusion his pupils. We should do him injustice if we turned to these volumes for an impartial and scientific account of Chinese history. He added to the record imaginary speeches and stories, into which he poured as much as he could of his solicitude for morals and his admiration for wisdom. If he idealized the past of his country, he did no more than we do with our own less ancient past. If already our earliest presidents have become sages and saints in hardly a century or two, surely to the historians of 1,000 years hence they will seem as virtuous and perfect as Yao and Shun. To these 5 Qing, the Chinese add 4 Shu, or books, of the philosophers to constitute the 9 Classics. First and most important of these is the Lun Yu, or Discourses and Dialogues, known to the English world, through a whim of Legas, as the Analects, that is, the collected fragments of Confucius. These pages are not from the master's hand, but record with exemplary clarity and brevity his opinions and pronouncements as remembered by his followers. They were compiled within a few decades of Confucius's death, perhaps by the disciples of his disciples, and are the least unreliable guide that we have to his philosophy. The most interesting and instructive of all statements in the Chinese classics appears in the 4th and 5th paragraphs of the 2nd Shu, a work known to the Chinese as Ta Shui, or the Great Learning. The Confucian philosopher and editor, Chu Shi, attributed these paragraphs to Confucius, and the remainder of the treatise to Tseng Tsan, one of the younger disciples. Kea Kui, a scholar of the 1st century A.D., attributed the work to Kung Chi, grandson of Confucius. The skeptical scholars of today agree that the authorship is unknown. All students concur in ascribing to this grandson the 3rd philosophical classic of China, the Chung Yung, or Doctrine of the Mean. The last of the Shu is the Book of Mencius, of which we shall speak presently. With this volume ends the classic literature, but not the classic period, of Chinese thought. There were, as we shall see, rebels and heretics of every kind to protest against that masterpiece of conservatism, the philosophy of Confucius. 3. The agnosticism of Confucius. A fragment of logic, the philosopher and the urchins, a formula of wisdom. Let us try to do justice to this doctrine. It is the view of life that we shall take when we round out our first half-century, and for all that we know it may be wiser than the poetry of our youth. If we ourselves are heretics and young, this is the philosophy that we must marry to our own in order that our half-truths may beget some understanding. We shall not find here a system of philosophy, that is, a consistent structure of logic, metaphysics, ethics, and politics, dominated by one idea, like the palaces of Nebuchadrezzar, which bore on every brick the name of the ruler. Confucius taught the art of reasoning, not through rules or syllogisms, but by the perpetual play of his keen mind upon the opinions of his pupils. When they went out from his school, they knew nothing about logic, but they could think clearly and to the point. Clarity and honesty of thought and expression were the first lessons of the master. The whole end of speech is to be understood, a lesson not always remembered by philosophy. When you know a thing, to hold that you know it, and when you do not, to admit the fact. This is knowledge. Obscurity of thought and insincere inaccuracy of speech seemed to him national calamities. If a prince who was not in actual fact and power a prince should cease to be called a prince, if a father who was not a fatherly father should cease to be called a father, if an unfilial son should cease to be called a son, then men might be stirred to reform abuses too often covered up with words. Hence, when Tse Lu told Confucius, "The Prince of Wei has been waiting for you, in order with you to administer the government, what will you consider the first thing to be done?" he answered, to the astonishment of prince and pupil, "What is necessary to rectify names." Since his dominating passion was the application of philosophy to conduct and government, Confucius avoided metaphysics and tried to turn the minds of his followers from all recondite or celestial concerns. Though he made occasional mention of heaven and prayer, and counseled his disciples to observe sedulously the traditional rites of ancestor worship and national sacrifice, he was so negative in his answers to theological questions that modern commentators agree in calling him an agnostic. When Tse Kung asked him, "Do the dead have knowledge, or are they without knowledge?" Confucius refused to make any definite reply. When Ke Lu asked about serving the spirits of the dead, the master responded, "While you are not able to serve men, how can you serve their spirits?" Ke Lu asked, "I venture to ask about death," and was answered, "While you do not know life, how can you know about death?" When Fan Che inquired what constituted wisdom, Confucius said, "To give one's self earnestly to the duties due to men, and, while respecting spiritual beings, to keep aloof from them, may be called wisdom." His disciples tell us that the subjects on which the master did not talk were extraordinary things, feats of strength, disorder, and spiritual beings. They were much disturbed by this philosophic modesty, and doubtless wished that the master would solve for them the mysteries of heaven. The book of Lie Tse tells with glee the fable of the street urchins who ridiculed the master when he confessed his inability to answer their simple question, "Is the sun nearer to the earth at dawn, when it is larger, or at noon, when it is hotter?" The only metaphysics that Confucius would recognize was the search for unity in all phenomena, and the effort to find some stabilizing harmony between the laws of right conduct and the regularities of nature. "Say," he said to one of his favorites, "you think, I suppose, that I am one who learns many things and keeps them in his memory?" Tse Kung replied, "Yes, but perhaps it is not so." "No," was the answer. "I seek unity, all-pervading." This, after all, is the essence of philosophy. His master passion was for morality. The chaos of his time seemed to him a moral chaos, caused perhaps by the weakening of the ancient faith and the spread of sophist skepticism as to right and wrong. It was to be cured not by a return to the old beliefs, but by an earnest search for more complete knowledge, and a moral regeneration based upon a soundly regulated family life. The Confucian program is expressed pithily and profoundly in the famous paragraphs of the Great Learning. The ancients who wished to illustrate the highest virtue throughout the empire first ordered well their own states. Wishing to order well their states, they first regulated their families. Wishing to regulate their families, they first cultivated their own selves. Wishing to cultivate their own selves, they first rectified their hearts. Wishing to rectify their hearts, they first sought to be sincere in their thoughts. Wishing to be sincere in their thoughts, they first extended to the utmost their knowledge. Such extension of knowledge lay in the investigation of things. Things being investigated, knowledge became complete. Their knowledge being complete, their thoughts were sincere. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. Their hearts being rectified, their own selves were cultivated. Their own selves being cultivated, their families were regulated. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. Their states being rightly governed, the whole empire was made tranquil and happy. This is the keynote and substance of the Confucian philosophy. One might forget all other words of the master and his disciples, and yet carry away with these the essence of the matter, and a complete guide to life. The world is at war, says Confucius, because its constituent states are improperly governed. These are improperly governed because no amount of legislation can take the place of the natural social order provided by the family. The family is in disorder and fails to provide this natural social order because men forget that they cannot regulate their families if they do not regulate themselves. They fail to regulate themselves because they have not rectified their hearts. That is, they have not cleansed their own souls of disorderly desires. Their hearts are not rectified because their thinking is insincere, doing scant justice to reality and concealing rather than revealing their own natures. Their thinking is insincere because they let their wishes discolor the facts and determine their conclusions, instead of seeking to extend their knowledge to the utmost by impartially investigating the nature of things. Let men seek impartial knowledge, and their thinking will become sincere. Let their thoughts be sincere, and their hearts will be cleansed of disorderly desires. Let their hearts be so cleansed, and their own selves will be regulated. Let their own selves be regulated, and their families will automatically be regulated, not by virtuous sermonizing or passionate punishments, but by the silent power of example itself. Let the family be so regulated with knowledge, sincerity, and example, and it will give forth such spontaneous social order that successful government will once more be a feasible thing. Let the state maintain internal justice and tranquility, and all the world will be peaceful and happy. It is a counsel of perfection, and forgets that man is a beast of prey, but like Christianity it offers us a goal to strike at and a ladder to climb. It is one of the golden texts of philosophy. 4. The Way of the Higher Man. Another portrait of the sage, elements of character, the golden rule. Wisdom, therefore, begins at home, and the foundation of society is a disciplined individual in a disciplined family. Confucius agreed with Goethe that self-development is the root of social development, and when Tse Lu asked him, "What constitutes the higher man?" he replied, "The cultivation of himself with reverential care." Here and there throughout the dialogues we find him putting together, piece by piece, his picture of the ideal man, a union of philosopher and saint producing the sage. The Superman of Confucius is composed of 3 virtues, severally selected as supreme by Socrates, Nietzsche, and Christ: intelligence, courage, and goodwill. The higher man is anxious lest he should not get truth. He is not anxious lest poverty should come upon him. He is Catholic, not partisan. He requires that in what he says there should be nothing inaccurate. But he is no mere intellect, not merely a scholar or a lover of knowledge. He has character as well as intelligence. Where the solid qualities are in excess of accomplishments, we have rusticity. Where the accomplishments are in excess of the solid qualities, we have the manners of a clerk. When the accomplishments and solid qualities are equally blended, we then have the man of complete virtue. Intelligence is intellect with its feet on the earth. The foundation of character is sincerity. Is it not just an entire sincerity which marks the higher man? He acts before he speaks, and afterwards speaks according to his actions. In archery we have something like the way of the higher man. When the archer misses the center of the target, he turns round and seeks for the cause of his failure in himself. What the higher man seeks is in himself. What the lower man seeks is in others. The higher man is distressed by his want of ability, not by men's not knowing him. And yet he dislikes the thought of his name not being mentioned after his death. He is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. He seldom speaks. When he does, he is sure to hit the point. That wherein the higher man cannot be equaled is simply this: his work, which other men cannot see. He is moderate in word and deed. In everything the higher man conforms with the path of the mean. For there is no end of things by which man is affected, and when his likings and dislikings are not subject to regulation, he is changed into the nature of things as they come before him. The higher man moves so as to make his movements in all generations a universal path. He behaves so as to make his conduct in all generations a universal law. He speaks so as to make his words in all generations a universal norm. He accepts completely the golden rule, which is here laid down explicitly 4 centuries before Hillel and 5 centuries before Christ. Chung Kung asked about perfect virtue. The master said, "Not to do unto others as you would not wish done unto yourself." The principle is stated again and again, always negatively, and once in a single word. Tse Kung asked, "Is there one word which may serve as a rule of practice for all one's life?" The master said, "Is not reciprocity such a word?" Nevertheless, he did not wish, like Lao Tse, to return good for evil, and when one of his pupils asked him, "What do you say concerning the principle that injury should be recompensed with kindness?" he replied more sharply than was his custom, "With what, then, will you recompense kindness? Recompense injury with justice, and recompense kindness with kindness." The very basis of the higher man's character is an overflowing sympathy towards all men. He is not angered by the excellences of other men. When he sees men of worth, he thinks of equaling them. When he sees men of low worth, he turns inward and examines himself. For there are few faults that we do not share with our neighbors. He pays no attention to slander or violent speech. He is courteous and affable to all, but he does not gush forth indiscriminate praise. He treats his inferiors without contempt and his superiors without seeking to court their favor. He is grave in deportment, since men will not take seriously one who is not serious with them. He is slow in words and earnest in conduct. He is not quick with his tongue or given to clever repartee. He is earnest because he has work to do, and this is the secret of his unaffected dignity. He is courteous even to his familiars, but maintains his reserve towards all, even his son. Confucius sums up the qualities of his higher man, so similar to the megalopsychos, or great-minded man, of Aristotle, in these words: "The higher man has 9 things which are subjects with him of thoughtful consideration. In regard to the use of his eyes, he is anxious to see clearly. In regard to his countenance, he is anxious that it should be benign. In regard to his demeanor, he is anxious that it should be respectful. In regard to his speech, he is anxious that it should be sincere. In regard to his doing of business, he is anxious that it should be reverently careful. In regard to what he doubts about, he is anxious to question others. When he is angry, he thinks of the difficulties his anger may involve him in. When he sees gain to be got, he thinks of righteousness." 5. Confucian politics. Popular sovereignty, government by example, the decentralization of wealth, music and manners, socialism and revolution. None but such men, in the judgment of Confucius, could restore the family and redeem the state. Society rests upon the obedience of the children to their parents and of the wife to her husband. When these go, chaos comes. Only one thing is higher than this law of obedience, and that is the moral law. In serving his parents, a son may remonstrate with them, but gently. When he sees that they do not incline to follow his advice, he shows an increased degree of reverence, but does not abandon his purpose. When the command is wrong, a son should resist his father, and a minister should resist his august master. Here was one root of Mencius's doctrine of the divine right of revolution. There was not much of the revolutionist in Confucius. Perhaps he suspected that the inheritors of a revolution are made of the same flesh as the men whom it deposed. But he wrote bravely enough in the Book of Odes, "Before the sovereigns of the Shang dynasty had lost the hearts of the people, they were the mates of God. Take warning from the house of Shang. The great decree is not easily preserved." The people are the actual and proper source of political sovereignty, for any government that does not retain their confidence sooner or later falls. Tse Kung asked about government. The master said, "The requisites of government are 3, that there should be sufficiency of food, sufficiency of military equipment, and the confidence of the people in their ruler." Tse Kung said, "If it cannot be helped and one of these must be dispensed with, which of the 3 should be foregone first?" "The military equipment," said the master. Tse Kung again asked, "If it cannot be helped and one of the remaining 2 must be dispensed with, Which of them should be foregone? The master answered, Part with the food. From of old death has been the lot of all men, but if the people have no faith in their rulers, there is no standing for the state. The first principle of government, in the view of Confucius, is as the first principle of character, sincerity. Therefore, the prime instrument of government is good example. The ruler must be an eminence of model behavior, from which, by prestige imitation, right conduct will pour down upon his people. Kai Kong asked Confucius about government, saying, What do you say to killing the unprincipled for the good of the principled? Confucius replied, Sir, in carrying on your government, why should you use killing at all? Let your evinced desires be for what is good, and the people will be good. The relation between superiors and inferiors is like that between the wind and the grass. The grass must bend when the wind blows across it. He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place, and all the stars turn toward it. Kai Kong asked how to cause the people to reverence their ruler, to be faithful to him, and to urge themselves to virtue. The master said, Let him preside over them with gravity, then they will reverence him. Let him be filial and kind to all, then they will be faithful to him. Let him advance the good and teach the incompetent, then they will eagerly seek to be virtuous. As good example is the first instrument of government, good appointments are the second. Employ the upright and put aside the crooked. In this way the crooked can be made to be upright. The administration of government, says the doctrine of the mean, lies in getting proper men. Such men are to be got by means of the ruler's own character. What would not a ministry of higher men do, even in one generation, to cleanse the state and guide the people to a loftier level of civilization? First of all, they would avoid foreign relations as much as possible, and seek to make their states so independent of outside supplies that it would never be tempted to war for them. They would reduce the luxury of courts, and seek a wide distribution of wealth, for the centralization of wealth is the way to scatter the people, and letting it be scattered among them is the way to collect the people. They would decrease punishments and increase public instruction. For there being instruction, there will be no distinction of classes. The higher subjects would be forbidden to the mediocre, but music would be taught to all. When one has mastered music completely and regulates his heart and mind accordingly, the natural, correct, gentle, and sincere heart is easily developed, and joy attends its development. The best way to improve manners and customs is to pay attention to the composition of the music played in the country. Manners and music should not for a moment be neglected by anyone. Benevolence is akin to music, and righteousness to good manners. Good manners, too, must be a care of the government, for when manners decay, the nation decays with them. Imperceptibly, the rules of propriety form at least the outward character, and add to the sage the graciousness of the gentleman. We become what we do. Politically, the usages of propriety serve as dikes for the people against evil excesses, and he who thinks the old embankments useless and destroys them is sure to suffer from the desolation caused by overflowing water. One almost hears the stern voice of the angry master echoing those words today from that hall of the classics, where once all his words were engraved in stone, and which revolution has left desecrated and forlorn. And yet Confucius too had his utopias and dreams, and might have sympathized at times with men who, convinced that the dynasty had lost the great decree or mandate of heaven, dragged down one system of order in the hope of rearing a better one on the ruins. In the end he became a socialist and gave his fancy rein. When the great principle of the great similarity prevails, the whole world becomes a republic. They elect men of talents, virtue, and ability. They talk about sincere agreement and cultivate universal peace. Thus men do not regard as their parents only their own parents, nor treat as their children only their own children. A competent provision is secured for the aged till their death, employment for the middle-aged, and the means of growing up for the young. The widowers, widows, orphans, childless men, and those who are disabled by disease are all sufficiently maintained. Each man has his rights, and each woman her individuality safeguarded. They produce wealth, disliking that it should be thrown away upon the ground, but not wishing to keep it for their own gratification. Disliking idleness, they labor, but not alone with a view to their own advantage. In this way selfish schemings are repressed and find no way to arise. Robbers, filchers, and rebellious traitors do not exist. Hence the outer doors remain open and are not shut. This is the state of what I call the great similarity. 6. The influence of Confucius. The Confucian scholars, their victory over the legalists, defects of Confucianism, the contemporaneity of Confucius. The success of Confucius was posthumous but complete. His philosophy had struck a practical and political note that endeared it to the Chinese after death had removed the possibility of his insisting upon its realization. Since men of letters never quite reconciled themselves to being men of letters, the literati of the centuries after Confucius attached themselves sedulously to his doctrine as a road to influence and public employment, and created a class of Confucian scholars destined to become the most powerful group in the empire. Schools sprang up here and there for the teaching of the master's philosophy as handed down by his disciples, developed by Mencius, and amended by 1,000 pundits in the course of time. And these schools, as the intellectual centers of China, kept civilization alive during centuries of political collapse, much as the monks preserved some measure of ancient culture and some degree of social order during the Dark Ages that followed the fall of Rome. A rival school, the legalists, disputed for a while this leadership of Confucian thought in the political world and occasionally molded the policy of the state. To make government depend upon the good example of the governors and the inherent goodness of the governed, said the legalists, was to take a considerable risk. History had offered no superabundance of precedents for the successful operation of these idealistic principles. Not men but laws should rule, they argued, and laws must be enforced until, becoming a second nature to a society, they are obeyed without force. The people are not intelligent enough to rule themselves well. They prosper best under an aristocracy. Even tradesmen are not too intelligent, but pursue their interests very often to the detriment of the state. Perhaps, said some of the legalists, it would be wiser for the state to socialize capital, monopolize trade, and prevent the manipulation of prices and the concentration of wealth. These were ideas that were destined to appear again and again in the history of Chinese government. In the long run, the philosophy of Confucius triumphed. We shall see later how the mighty Shi Huangti, with the legalist for his prime minister, sought to end the influence of Confucius by ordering that all existing Confucian literature should be burned. But the power of the word proved stronger than that of the sword. The books which the first emperor sought to destroy became holy and precious through his enmity, and men died as martyrs in the effort to preserve them. When Shi Huangti and his brief dynasty had passed away, a wiser emperor, Wu Ti, brought the Confucian literature out of hiding, gave office to its students, and strengthened the Han dynasty by introducing the ideas and methods of Confucius into the education of Chinese youth and statesmanship. Sacrifices were decreed in honor of Confucius. The texts of the classics were by imperial command engraved on stone, and became the official religion of the state. Rivaled at times by the influence of Taoism, and eclipsed for a while by Buddhism, Confucianism was restored and exalted by the Tang dynasty, and the great Dai Tsung ordered that a temple should be erected to Confucius, and sacrifices offered in it by scholars and officials in every town and village of the empire. During the Sung dynasty, a virile school of Neo-Confucians arose, whose innumerable commentaries on the classics spread the philosophy of the master, in varied dilutions, throughout the Far East, and stimulated a philosophical development in Japan. From the rise of the Han dynasty to the fall of the Manchus, that is, for 2,000 years, the doctrine of Confucius molded and dominated the Chinese mind. The history of China might be written in terms of that influence. For generation after generation, the writings of the master were the texts of the official schools, and nearly every lad who came through those schools had learned those texts by heart. The stoic conservatism of the ancient sage sank almost into the blood of the people, and gave to the nation and to its individuals a dignity and profundity unequaled elsewhere in the world or in history. With the help of this philosophy, China developed a harmonious community life, a zealous admiration for learning and wisdom, and a quiet and stable culture, which made Chinese civilization strong enough to survive every invasion, and to remold every invader in its own image. Only in Christianity and in Buddhism can we find again so heroic an effort to transmute into decency the natural brutality of men. And today, as then, no better medicine could be prescribed for any people suffering from the disorder generated by an intellectualist education, a decadent moral code, and a weakened fiber of individual and national character than the absorption of the Confucian philosophy by the nation's youth. But that philosophy could not be a complete nourishment in itself. It was well fitted to a nation struggling out of chaos and weakness into order and strength, but it would prove a shackle upon a country compelled by international competition to change and grow. The rules of propriety, destined to form character and social order, became a straitjacket, forcing almost every vital action into a prescribed and unaltered mold. There was something prim and Puritan about Confucianism, which checked too thoroughly the natural and vigorous impulses of mankind. Its virtue was so complete as to bring sterility. No room was left in it for pleasure and adventure, and little for friendship and love. It helped to keep woman in supine debasement, and its cold perfection froze the nation into a conservatism as hostile to progress as it was favorable to peace. We must not blame all this upon Confucius. One cannot be expected to do the thinking of 20 centuries. We ask of a thinker only that as the result of a lifetime of thought, he shall in some way illuminate our path to understanding. Few men have done this more certainly than Confucius. As we read him and perceive how little of him must be erased today because of the growth of knowledge and the change of circumstance, how soundly he offers us guidance even in our contemporary world, we forget his platitudes and his unbearable perfection and join his pious grandson, Kung Chi, in that superlative eulogy which began the deification of Confucius. Confucius handed down the doctrines of Yao and Shun as if they had been his ancestors, and elegantly displayed the regulations of Wen and Wu, taking them as his model. Above, he harmonized with the times of heaven, and below he was conformed to the water and land. He may be compared to heaven and earth in their supporting and containing, their overshadowing and curtaining all things. He may be compared to the 4 seasons in their alternating progress, and to the sun and moon in their successive shining. All-embracing and vast, he is like heaven. Deep and active as a fountain, he is like the abyss. He is seen, and the people all reverence him. He speaks, and the people all believe him. He acts, and the people are all pleased with him. Therefore his fame overspreads the Middle Kingdom, and extends to all barbarous tribes. Wherever ships and carriages reach, wherever the strength of man penetrates, wherever the heavens overshadow and the earth sustains, wherever the sun and moon shine, wherever frosts and dews fall, all who have blood and breath unfeignedly honor and love him. Hence it is said, he is the equal of heaven. 3. Socialists and Anarchists. The 200 years that followed upon Confucius were centuries of lively controversy and raging heresy. Having discovered the pleasures of philosophy, some men like Hui Zhe and Kung Sun Lung played with logic and invented paradoxes of reasoning as varied and subtle as Zeno's. Philosophers flocked to the city of Luoyang, as in the same centuries they were flocking to Benares and Athens, and they enjoyed in the Chinese capital all that freedom of speech and thought which made Athens the intellectual center of the Mediterranean world. Sophists called Tsung Heng Kia, or crisscross philosophers, crowded the capital to teach all and sundry the art of persuading any man to anything. To Luoyang came Mencius, inheritor of the mantle of Confucius, Zhuangzi, greatest of Lao Tse's followers, Shunzi, the apostle of original evil, and Mo Ti, the prophet of universal love. 1. Mo Ti, altruist, an early logician, Christian, and pacifist. Mo Ti, said his enemy Mencius, loved all men and would gladly wear out his whole being from head to heel for the benefit of mankind. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.